Okay, well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the latest book club. I'm delighted tonight we welcome Professor Julian Evans, OBE, who'll be very well known to RFS members for his the courses that he runs for us. Is a regular contributor to our quarterly journal of Forestry. It's actually helps me with that as well. One of our on the panel for that. Julian is also a forestry commissioner, was formerly professor of forestry at Imperial College, and also previously Forestry Commission's chief research officer. He's also been a past president of the Institute of Chartered Foresters, vice president of the Commonwealth Forestry Association, and also chaired the Forestry Commission's Expert Committee on Forest Science. So there's a long CV. Obviously, Julian's extremely well qualified in the subject of forestry, but obviously tonight we're also going to delve into another one of his interests, which is his faith, looking at his book, God's Trees. Welcome, Julian.
Hello, thank you.
So tonight we'll follow the similar sort of regime that we've done previously. So essentially, we'll obviously be hearing more about Julian's book. We'll ask him to take us through that. We've got some slides to show that will bring that to life a little bit. And then there will be chance for people to ask questions. So that's the plan. I'm now going to hand over to my co-host, Wendy.
So hello and good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us. I'm Wendy Neckar. I'm Communications Officer for the Royal Forestry Society. And I hope this is a book that you've all loved. I personally think you can enjoy it, whether you're a person of faith or a person of no faith. And it takes a real interesting forager's look at the events and the stories which had shaped so many of our cultures. And for me, particularly in the middle of winter, wow, was it lovely to look at some of those really hot climate pictures and to revisit stories that certainly peppered my childhood. And then I shared Julian's sort of frustration really with the generalizations that we all use. Today we talk about a pine tree or a fir tree. In the Bible they refer to the thorn tree or the fig tree. And it's Julian's search for the specifics, his forester's knowledge, which makes all of this so fascinating. And then I looked at the topics that were covered, really. A totally different look at how you would normally look at the Bible. And there are so many things of familiarity. There's the landscapes, which were clearly once far more wooded than they are. There's cultures and people who were far more familiar with the woods and the trees and the specific uses of woods. There's the lovely story, and there's a fabulous picture of the first known introduction of one tree from one land to another tree, when they took in 1456 BCE, Myrrh, I think it was, or Myrrh to Egypt. And I love that engraved, that picture in stone, I think is just amazing. And then there's the importance of gardens. We talk about going to a National Trust garden now. There, the gardens of Eden and Gethsemane must have been fabulous places of note. There are the landmarks, there are the trees that commemorated battles. There's the extreme weather events that obviously impacted the landscape too. And there are even royal parks. So, Julian, let's have a chat to you really about what set you off with this book. And I was reading the first edition. I know that you've moved on to a second edition. So perhaps you'd like to tell us a little bit about your journey. And I know you have some specific pictures too about the sycamore fig. So perhaps it's over to you for a moment.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. And everyone, welcome. The journey actually began in the 1980s. I'd written my first book about plantation forestry in the tropics and was in the middle of writing Silvicultural Broadleaf Woodland, which came out as a Forestry Commission bulletin. And somebody suggested, why don't you bring together your young Christian faith, I became a Christian in my 20s, and the fact that you're writing books on forestry. It was somebody in our church who was starting up a new publishing house. Well, I began. I wrote 3 chapters, but I'm afraid his publishing house wasn't a success and he went bust. And so that was it. So it all began. My late wife was really supportive of that initiative, but, you know, it was filed away. 25 years, a whole career, and many books later, I was on a visit to Israel with the Reverend Clive Anderson, who was leading it, who's a writer, and also Mark Roberts, who's the chief executive of Day One, a publisher. Well, need I say more? Because the rest is, as they say, is history. They reawakened the thought that what about a book that brings together one's Christian journey and also the subject of trees, and looking at it from that perspective, using that theme. And I do just want to say that in taking on a task of this kind, an awful lot of people have been really helpful to developing it. We'll see some pictures that Dan Luscombe, for example, who's the curator at Bedgebury, the cover picture of the book was taken by him. We have other pictures. We have lovely illustrations by Veronica Pinchin. She did 26 original bits of artwork in the book, which is super. I took many of the pictures. My son Stephen was really helpful. I explained that my late wife in the 1980s was supportive. Sadly, she passed away in the early 2000s, but Margaret, my wife, who's actually with me today, you can actually see her. No, you can't, just there in the picture. She was hugely supportive as well. Also, just a quick mention of John White, who was many years ago the curator at Westonbirt. He actually helped with the compendium, where at the back of the book, having the book itself written as a kind of commentary going through the Bible, at the back we've got 20 pages of more detail about species. Anyway, moving on very quickly, first to the second edition. First thing to say is, if you've got the first edition, you don't need to rush out and buy a second. Sorry, publisher, if you're listening, because the changes were quite small. I added 3 trees, such as manna tamarix. I changed a few pictures, updated a few things. But now, can I shamelessly name drop? Because 2 really senior, well-known scientists in our country who've also written books reflecting on the Bible, Professor Sir Ian Prance, who was director of Kew, he sent me his book, and Professor Sir Colin Humphreys from Cambridge, he also sent me a couple of his books as well. And as I was working on the second edition, I was able to weave those in. So let me do a screen share at this point. I give lots of talks about trees in the Bible, and this is sort of the threshold slide to it. And you'll see this lovely, the middle of a lovely cedar of Lebanon that's actually growing in the Taurus Mountains of southern Turkey, taken by Dan Luscombe. And you can see there it's on the cover of the book itself there on the right-hand side. Let me give you just one example of something I learned as I was writing this book, how knowing the species is so helpful. And the one I begin with is the sycamore fig. Now, many of you will be botanists, foresters, and you will know the sycamore spelt with an A. And many of our Bibles, and indeed you can see it there on the left, spell it with an A, not on the headline, but actually in the text. But of course, the tree that's a sycamore fig is nothing to do with the sycamore that we have, which is a maple, of course. Now, I go to this picture because it's the sycamore fig in the town of Jericho, in the West Bank area of the Middle East. And you're taken to this tree as a tourist and said, oh, this is the one that Zacchaeus climbed. Well, the story of Zacchaeus is in Luke's Gospel, Luke chapter 19, verses 1 to 10, and I've just got a few verses there. And let me read it. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was wealthy. He wanted to see who Jesus was, but because he was short, he could not see over the crowd. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. Now, I love the fact that Luke wrote it. Luke was a doctor, we believe, so rather like a scientist, and he tells us it wasn't just a tree, any old tree. He actually told us what it was. Now, it's important, I think, and it helps enrich this story, this account of Zacchaeus's conversion. Because just to remind you, this is the common fig, and the sycamore fig is part of the family, the genus Ficus, that you see all over the subtropics. And here's that tree again. But we are told in the Old Testament that there were something that shepherds would do would be to look after sycamore fig trees. And here's a quote from a minor prophet. And by the way, the prophet is minor, not because he's short, just because we haven't got a lot of text or a lot of what they said. Amos answered Amaziah, I was neither a prophet nor the son of a prophet, but I was a shepherd, and I also took care of sycamore fig trees. Now, what's that all about? Well, what it's all about is this, that there you can see the figs actually on this great big tree. They are growing right from the trunk, a thing that we call in botany cauliflory. And what shepherds would do would be to climb into the tree, and they may cut off the odd branch to help feed the sheep in terms of giving them some forage. But they would scar those figs, rub in just a little bit of olive oil, and that would turn those figs, make them edible in a few weeks' time. And they were known as the poor man's figs. So knowing that, when the people of Jericho saw their despised chief tax collector climbing a tree, they would know that the only other grown-ups who would climb trees were the much marginalized shepherds. Certainly in New Testament times, the shepherds were very much on the periphery of society. Here was a man who wanted to see Jesus, and he was prepared to do all of this to get a sight of Jesus. And I'll leave you as viewers to read the rest of the story, the wonderful outcome that happened. So knowing that it was a sycamore fig actually just gives us that little extra bit of colour.
Oh, that's brilliant. That's so fascinating. I think you've got some pictures and some stories to share about a quite remarkable tree. And I believe it was the Israelites, and it helped them to find clean water from foul water. And you have an explanation for all of that, Julian?
I have a possible explanation, but that's one of the things of
So
looking at.
Please share.
So I'll stay with this screen share, the plant science and a difficult text, because those of you who are here in the book club, something that Wendy asked me is, what has surprised me most in writing this book? And I wrote down two things. First of all, the remarkable reliability of scripture about what the Bible was saying, whether it was about the timber trade, whether it was about the types of species, whether it was even about practices like coppicing that we find mentioned, for example, in the book of Job and so on. But the other thing that surprised me is that some really difficult texts, verses, that seem to be on the surface, well, how do you explain it? Is it simply an old wives' tale? Is it simply a fairy tale? Well, maybe not. And this is one example. And if I read the few verses there on the left, oh, by the way, on the right, while I'm reading on the left, is one of Veronica Pinton's lovely illustrations. It's nothing to do with the text, but it's so beautiful. It's actually the Judas tree and showing that beautiful color. But where are we in the Bible? The Israelites have finally left Egypt. The Exodus has begun. And then Pharaoh's army has been chasing them. They've had that miraculous crossing of the Red Sea. And then it all seems to go wrong. Then Moses led Israel from the Red Sea, and they went into the desert of Shur. For 3 days, they traveled in the desert without finding water. When they came to Marah, they could not drink its water because it was bitter. That's why the place is called Marah. So the people grumbled against Moses, saying, "What are we to drink?" Then Moses cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a piece of wood or a piece of tree. The Hebrew word for wood there is etz, which is a general word for trees, tree products, and so on. He threw it into the water, and the water became fit to drink. Now, when you read Bible commentaries, they usually skip over this verse. Somebody writing about trees and forests and wood in the Bible can't. And so one began to explore that. And when I was writing my first book about plantation forestry in the tropics, I remember coming across an article about trees that cleaned water. And I just wondered, perhaps, is this miracle explained by Moses knowing, or God revealing to Moses, what this might have been? And the tree that does clean water is known as the moringa. It's quite widely planted in development across the tropics and subtropics. And this one is Moringa peregrina. It's the tree of the semi-desert, and where we believe the Israelites were in the desert of Shur, there would have been these moringa trees. Now, up in the top left of the crown, you may just be able to see some long pods that are about a foot, about 30 centimeters long. And it is the seeds inside those pods that, if you crush them, add the powder to water, the proteins they release causes all the dirt in the water to precipitate out, to flocculate, taking with it 98% of the bacteria. Now, what is remarkable is that just one tree will provide enough seeds to clean around 7,000 gallons or 30,000 litres of water. How long does it take? Actually, only about an hour and a half. So when you put those ingredients together, that bit of science, you realize that here, even for tens of thousands of people walking through the desert, if they've got access to moringa seeds, and we know the trees would have been there, it may be how God showed Moses to clean the water. And just to show you that it is used today, here at the top of there are two, I've taken a photo of two different technical publications. The first one, Water Clarification Using Moringa Oleifera. That's by GTZ, which is German aid, hence the rather stilted English. And then at the bottom, the possibility of using Moringa peregrina seeds compared with polyaluminum chloride in sewage treatment. That's in the Journal of Health and Environmental Science in Iran, published in 2010. And so, in fact, this use of moringa seed to clean water is actually still current today. And in fact, if you go to the Eden Project in Cornwall and you join their desert survival course, they will actually teach you how to do it. And they've actually got a little leaflet that you can pick up showing using moringa to clean the water. Now, I can't sit here in this book club, in this webinar, and say to you that is the explanation for that rather mysterious verse in Exodus. But what I can say is it takes that verse from perhaps being a fairy tale or a nice idea, but oh yeah, we don't believe it. No, not at all. It could be that that was how it happened scientifically. Just a few other pictures to illustrate different aspects that in writing a book, a coffee table book of this type, I came across, and one that Wendy was asking me, cedars of Lebanon, which was the timber used for the fabulous Temple of Solomon, as well as for David's palace. We tend to think of broad spreading trees, but here's a lovely picture that Nan Luscombe took in the Taurus Mountains of southern Turkey, and you can see nice timber trees, timber quality. And we know that a lot of cedar was imported from Lebanon, and probably from Amanus, or Syria as it's called today, to help build the temple in Jerusalem in the time of Solomon. And we also know that cedar was so valued in ancient times that even 1,000 years before Solomon, the logs were being taken from Lebanon, rafted down the Mediterranean coast, and hauled up the Nile for all the various roles and work being done in their temples there.
I personally love that picture, Julian. It's cedar of Lebanon as I've never seen it. It's just fantastic.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, obviously, sorry, I'm now leaving the Bible, but going to British Forestry. Cedar is actually one of the trees that we are looking at for climate change and so on, and for alternatives in the future because of climate change. And you can see, yes, it's obviously got timber potential. And interestingly, it's actually quite tolerant of chalky soils. So there's a little bit of extra tolerance, but sorry, I'm going off-piste. This is headed the Galilean boat, and I'll show you that just in a moment. I thought this is a picture showing what is believed to be the hillside where Jesus preached the Sermon on the Mount. And I was asked about the different kinds of crops that are growing there. And one can see the olive-coloured ones, which are obviously olives, but you've also in the foreground, you've got bananas. Just above the olives, there's an area of rather paler green, which are pomegranate, but also you've got avocados. So you've got two species, olive and pomegranate, which would be known in biblical times, and two species, banana and avocado, which have been brought in. And it's just sort of interesting to show the richness here in this part of Israel, around the Sea of Galilee. The reference to the boat is that in a museum on the north side of the Sea of Galilee is the hull of a 1st century fishing boat that was actually found in the silt when the Sea of Galilee was at one of its lowest levels as a result of years of drought in the 1980s. And what they've been able to discover is through carbon dating that it would have been contemporary with Christ, but also you can see there on the right-hand side the astonishing number of different woods and timbers that were used in its construction or in its repair. So this is another way that one is informed about the forestry, about the timber trade, about what takes place or took place in biblical times. If you Google Jesus boat, this is what comes up. We cannot say that Jesus actually sat in this particular one, but it's illustrative of the kinds of boats that would be fishing and sailing on the Sea of Galilee in his time. Just a couple more pictures. Wendy, you mentioned the Garden of Gethsemane. Here are the olives that you can visit today. The garden, the site of it at the bottom of the Mount of Olives, and you look across the Kidron Valley up to the ancient wall of Jerusalem. It is believed that it is the site of where Jesus prayed. Are these trees the actual ones amongst which he prayed? Because olives are very old. Well, the answer is no. These ones are about 1,000 years old, but they may be of the same genetic origin. They may have come up from regrowth, because we know that Vespasian in 69 AD laid waste to much of the surroundings of Jerusalem. And it could be that these new olives came up and then they were cut and then these ones came. But they're a fabulous thing to visit, fabulous site to visit. I think this is my last general picture. So as looking at places like which are named after a tree, and here is one of where a question of a metaphor. This lovely date palm, which is out in the churchyard of St. Anne, inside Old Jerusalem, just near the pool of Bethesda, is a wonderful tree. It's very elegant, very beautiful, and it's utilitarian, all sorts of uses. And Sennacherib, the Assyrian who we read much about in the Old Testament, is well known for all his destruction and so on. He actually called himself the palm tree of Assyria. He gave himself that name as a name of sort of prestige and honor. A really interesting picture and metaphor. So just a few extra things to enrich what I've been learning and wanting now to share with you. So thank you, and any questions and comments?
Good evening.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi, just to say, absolutely fascinating. Is there an equivalent to the moringa for water purification in the UK?
Yes and no. I'm not aware of a tree seed that could be used, but of course many of our water filters do actually contain activated charcoal. And when I was in discussion with Colin Humphreys, who I mentioned right at the beginning, he actually suggested that another way the people of Israel might have cleaned their water was to throw in lumps of charcoal. But that would have taken about 12, 15 hours to get rid of the bacteria. So I'm not aware of a tree in this country, but maybe others in the audience, others present today can help. But activated charcoal, yeah, is certainly a good filter.
Superb. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Over to you, Chris.
Thank you.
Yes,
Yeah,
thank you for that question.
Thank you. So, yeah, I would like to learn more about actually Solomon's Temple, because there's great passages in your book about that, and obviously within the Bible. So and it sounds incredible. I mean, obviously it's no longer standing. We can't visit it now, but the way it's described and the scale of it and its beauty, with juniper floors, olive inlays, and all the embellishments. Is there anything you'd like to just elaborate on the story of that, because it's such a wonderful part of the story?
Well, I've certainly heard it said that because God effectively gave David and principally Solomon the design of what to do, that perhaps it was the finest building at its time ever created. I've also discussed with an architect that the actual strength of a cedar beam would have limited its width to a certain size, because obviously its ability to hold up the roof and things like that. But I guess what for me is perhaps the most special element is that cedar is not only a durable timber, it's beautiful timber to work. And when the people went up to worship, they would have noticed something really special, which is certainly for a few years, you would have had a glorious aroma of cedar wood. And of course, many bits of furniture were made from cedar because of that lovely aroma. But there's one other really special characteristic which Solomon was keen to comply with because of the honor, in a sense, that he had of building the temple. There was to be no noise and no hammering in its building. And so all the stones that were used were fashioned, I believe, off-site. And so the whole thing was assembled in a really God-honoring way. But it was David who actually bought most of the timber from King Hiram, who was in Lebanon. And as I said, the logs were dragged down from the forest of Lebanon, rather like the ones we've seen, to the coast. They were then rafted along the coast and then hauled up to be fashioned into the temple there at Jerusalem. So a remarkable, a remarkable structure, and one, based on my reading of the timber trade in classical times, chimes perfectly with what we know about logs being rafted up and down the Mediterranean and the massive demand for cedar. Sorry, I'm beginning to go on as if I'm giving a long talk. Apologies for this, Chris, but your question is prompting further ideas. So valuable was cedar and some of the other conifers like juniper and Cilician fir that in parts of the mountains of Syria and also into Turkey, they have found Roman engravings from the Roman times saying that all timber of these 4 species are reserved to the emperor. Everything else is okay. So an early example of forest law is actually finding these plaques saying that nobody is allowed to cut the cedar, the juniper, the Cilician fir, and I can't remember what the other one was. Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
There
thank
you
you.
are. A precious building where God was worshipped.
Absolutely.
Oh, wouldn't it be wonderful to see it in real life?
Yes.
We have a couple of questions now from Anthony Lloyd. I don't know if we can unmute Anthony.
Very interesting. Thank you very much. I've always wondered about the burning bush. If we know anything about that as a species. And I just I wondered if we knew which tree provided the cross for the crucifixion.
Right. Yes, I'll have a go at both those. Thank you. The burning bush, I've got a few extra illustrations, but didn't include that. What's interesting about the burning bush is that it clearly arrested Moses' attention. It caught his attention. It was the way God got Moses' attention. I emphasize that because for many, many years, Moses had been a shepherd in the desert. He knew the desert well when he was living in Midian. And here was this, suddenly he saw a bush that was burning. And there are a number of explanations. If you go to the monastery in the Sinai Peninsula, is that St. Catherine's? They'll say it's a bramble. Well, maybe. Other people say it was a desert hawthorn that sometimes is aflame with red berries. Others have suggested it was where a volcanic vent was occurring and the flames from the vent were burning from behind this bush. But one of the difficulties in trying to track down exactly what it was is the following. The Bible makes quite clear the bush did not burn up. Secondly, Moses was said, don't come any closer. Don't come right up to it. Stay at a distance. You're on holy ground. And the ancient Pharisees, those who would investigate these things. Sorry, I've forgotten the name of the particular group who would do all this research. They have suggested that actually it wasn't something about the bush itself that was impressive, but that the fire was a mirage from over the horizon that settled on the bush, just like the crock of gold at the end of a rainbow. Hence why Moses was kept at a distance, hence why the flames didn't appear to burn the bush. But of course, the main thing from the Christian's point of view, or from the Jews' point of view, is that that is where God instructed Moses to go back to Egypt and all that followed with the Exodus. And also, interestingly, it was the place where God revealed to Moses his name. Moses said to God, "Who are you? Who shall I say when I go back to Egypt, to the people of Israel?" And God said, "Tell them I am who I am. That is my name, the I am." So Anthony, I can't really answer your question and say, yes, it was definitely this bush or that bush. There's a number of possible explanations.
Thank you very much.
Shared some with you. About the cross, what was the actual wood of the cross? That was certainly a question I was asked by several folk in church when I was writing the book. And unfortunately, wood in ground contact doesn't last long. It decays. So the likelihood of having any wood that survives 2,000 years, unless it's kept in silt or it's very, very dry, such as the tomb of Tutankhamun, for example, in the Valley of the Kings and so on. Or, of course, wood that is deep frozen in the glacier. I mean, these are the ways you can preserve it for 2,000 years in anoxic situations. So all we can do is make a guess, which is probably it was a conifer, probably Italian cypress, which is still today, well, any of you who've been to the Mediterranean, you'll have seen Italian cypress. It's a common tree of ornament, but also of cemeteries, graveyards, and so on. So you'll see there. So that's a candidate. Aleppo pine, a native pine to Israel, would be another candidate. And of course, we know that the numbers of crucifixions, there were a huge number from all the classical writings, thousands taking place at some points. So it's disappointing that I can't be absolutely certain. If you go to look at examples where people claim that there is a piece of the original cross, and there are certainly some of those relics in inverted commas, usually the wood, when it's looked at, is from a nearby oak or a nearby pine and so on, rather than from the true cross.
Yes.
So I really can't say a lot more other than just add one rather gruesome detail, because in 68 AD, an ossuary, a bone box, was found that contained the bones of a man who had been crucified. There was a nail going through his ankle bone, and on the head end of the nail, there was actually a piece of wood that could be identified. It was a kind of washer or a plaque, and that was a piece of olive. But it wouldn't have been used for the main cross itself. Olive trees were hugely protected, and they don't produce very long trunks, so it would be inappropriate. And the bit of olive was probably there, not so much to stop the victim working their foot loose, and sorry about this if you've not had your dinner,
Yeah.
probably to staunch the flow of blood so as to prolong the agony of death. The Romans did not want crucifixion to be a rapid means of death. Hence, when we read in the Easter story, when they came to Jesus, when they came to the three on the others, the two thieves either side, they broke their legs to ensure that he died. They died before the Jewish Sabbath began, but when they came to Jesus, they found that he had already dead and pierced his side. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Can't say a lot, but a bit.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, so thank you, Anthony. So now we've got John Brown has got an interesting question about a couple of species of tree that don't appear in the Bible, but it's quite interesting. So we go to John, please.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Oh, great. Thanks, Julian. Excellent presentation. Very, very interesting as always. I just wondered, when I read your book, there were two species that didn't appear. And of course, that's holly and yew. And of course, holly with its associations for the pricks of blood from the thorn of crowns, and yew because of its association with churchyards. But of course, I guess the answer is very simply, well, they're not in the Bible, and that's the end of the matter. Just that they have these such strong associations with the Bible that it just seems surprising that they weren't really mentioned at all.
I don't mention the holly, but I do have the yew mentioned in the compendium at the back, I think. I'll need to check.
I think very fleetingly, I think it was, Julian.
Yeah, and I know I've got one of Veronica's illustrations is actually of yew foliage. Yeah, in terms of the crown of thorns, there were an awful lot of shrubs and trees such as Ziziphus, the Christ thorn tree, which are prickly, spiky, thorny. And indeed, there are more words in Hebrew for prickly, spiky, thorny things than there are actually for named trees. So there would have been no lack of possible candidates for fashioning a crown of thorns for the Roman soldiers to be able to do that. And if you want to see an example in this country of one quite good candidate, the Jerusalem thorn, you can actually see an example of it in Kew Gardens. Now, I mean, don't laugh at this, but if you go to the Mediterranean garden in Kew in the normal way, turn left, walk up to the pagoda, turn right, and take the first little track on the left, you'll actually find there a Jerusalem thorn. And you'll see the thorn is about 3 inches long. They are fierce. However, there is one tree, Christ thorn, which even the English name is suggestive, that tradition suggests that that is the one that is used. And what's nasty about Christ thorn is that not only does it have long thorns, straight thorns, but also at the knuckle on the twigs, it actually has a bent back recursive thorn as well. So that once it was thrust onto Jesus's scalp, and then we know that he was hit around the head with staves, it would, be doubly painful and awful. So there would be no lack of prickly things in and around Jerusalem to quickly make a crown.
Wonderful. Thanks indeed, Julian.
Directions to the Judas thorn there, John.
The Jerusalem thorn, yeah.
Jerusalem thorn,
in
yeah.
Kew Gardens, yeah. I've been to it a couple of times and it's there. Yeah.
Clearly, yeah. We'll move now to someone who's called Anonymous Attendee. The question, Julian, is: do you have thoughts on Noah's Ark, whether it might still be extant, and what wood was used, etc.?
I will begin with the second, which is only a marginally easier than the first. And all we can say is that the wonderful translation in the King James Version, the authorized version of the Bible, of gopher wood is actually quite helpful, because it is a term associated with corking and resin and pitch. The idea of it is certainly associated with seafaring. More generally, a resinous timber, again, perhaps Italian cypress, perhaps a pine. Really, we can't say much more than that. We know it was something that took Noah many, many decades of construction to create. Will we find the ark high up on the mountains in the snows of Mount Ararat? I suggest not, because I would argue that this great big wooden boat that came to rest, and it's, by the way, probably a box ark shape. It wasn't like a child's Sunday school picture of a boat with a bow and a stern and so on, but probably just a large box shape. Estimates suggest its displacement would be 30 or 40,000 tons, a huge, huge object. I suggest that the woods would have been pilfered and taken away, rather like the stones in Hadrian's Wall, rather like the stripping of all the white coverings of the pyramids and so on. I mean, there have been expeditions to try and find it, and I've even got a book called the Noah's Ark Expedition, where they claim to have found something, and they found some oak deep down. There was a lot of excitement. There was a formation of rocks that looked like a great ship, but it was actually simply a geological formation. If you go to do a Google search on Noah's Ark, they will actually take you to, I think there's to a website in Hong Kong where you can go for a tour around what they have found. I would take it all with a great pinch of salt. I believe the story of the Noah's Ark and the flood, absolutely. But I think it's highly unlikely that we would find it. But gopher wood, yeah, that's a good as a term that has a nautical link to what would have been used in shipbuilding in that time.
Okay, thank you, Julian. So next, can we go to Adam, who's got a question?
Thank you. Thanks, Julian. Hello.
Is that
yeah.
Adam Bradbury, Adam?
It is. Hi.
Hello, Adam. Yeah, the editor of our journal, Adam. Right.
That's the one. So you've mentioned this numerous times, really, already in the course of your talk and the Q&A. But I'm interested in your sources, really, and your research methodology. How do you piece together, or what are your sources, and how do you piece them together to come up with a conclusion about, for example, which type of wood was used where?
Right. Okay. A number of things. As well as my own general interest as a forester and forest scientist, having worked in the tropics and worked in temperate country, being asked to look at trees in the Mediterranean was certainly a new area for me. And so in the course of research, I traveled to Egypt, to Jordan, twice to Israel. I'd been to Turkey in the past, but then went again to Turkey. I'd actually had a visit to northern Iraq in the very early 2000s. And so I was able to build, in terms of my own firsthand acquaintance, I won't put it stronger than that, but also I'm building on the shoulders of others. There are a number of books written by botanists more competent than I am about trees and plants in the Bible, of which without doubt the finest is Nigel Hepper's Encyclopedia of Plants. And I'm going to ask Margaret to extract it from my bookshelf to hold it up. It is so good. I'm going to go and find it and show you. It is so good. Hang on a second.
Well, we've not had this before on book club. Hopefully it's not going to take long to find it. Here we go.
Illustrated Bible Encyclopedia. And he was the deputy curator of Kew Botanic Gardens, Nigel Hepper. It is unrivaled. It is out of print, but if you can see it on Amazon and you want a really definitive work by a competent botanist, that is the book to get. So other people have done research, Adam, that have obviously helped somebody coming to a subject like this. And as I said, after the first edition was published, I had lots of contact with others who made their comments. And I had a very interesting piece of email correspondence with somebody who listened to one of my talks, talking all about the subject, because one of the difficulties in the New Testament is that Jesus uses the expression about the mustard tree and saying that our faith should be like the mustard tree, something that grows and develops and becomes established. But we know that the word mustard, synapis in Greek, refers to an annual, it's a brassica. So how can that become a tree? And I had an email exchange from somebody who was a Greek scholar and said actually the word dendron, which is a familiar word, dendrology, which we would use, which we would often translate from the Greek into tree, is actually used by Theophrastus, arguably the best plant scientist of classical times, to refer to annual crops like millet and that sort of thing. And so it was how you assemble these different strands of information that help you make progress. But you can't make all progress, Adam. Just a final comment. Of the 20 or 30 trees that are named in the Bible, we can be absolutely certain about a third of them. We can be pretty certain about another third by the context and the rough description. And there are some words, for example, like berosh in Hebrew, which would cover juniper, Cilician fir, and possibly pine, whereas we know cedar of Lebanon has its own name and so on. And then there's a final third where we simply make an informed guess. So, you've got that range. And an example of that is the Judas tree, which is not mentioned in the Bible, but we call it the Judas tree simply because the flowers, the flower buds look like drops of blood and they stay in bud for many, many weeks before the actual petals open out. So in terms of being on a scale of 1 to 5, if 1 is absolutely in the Bible, clearly identified, 5 not in the Bible and no relevance, the Judas tree is 4 3/4 in terms of that sort of scale, you know. So it's a nice idea. We don't even know whether he hung himself on a tree or whether he fell onto a field and so on. The Bible just describes the gory result that we have. So yes, Adam, one can make good progress, but we can't be absolutely definitive all the way through. And I try to make clear in writing of the book where we don't know, and we can't be sure.
Thank you. Fascinating. Thank you.
Okay, we've got a question to come, I think, from Chris Marrow, and just a quick reminder, there's still time to put your questions into the Q&A. So I think if we can turn to Chris now.
Hello.
Hi, Chris.
Hi, it's actually Carol.
Oh, sorry.
That's all right. No, just a query about the tree of knowledge in the Garden of Eden. In your book, yes, you don't sort of go any further with that, and we're always brought up, of course, to believe that Eve was given an apple. I just want your comments, really, comments and thoughts on the tree of knowledge. Yeah.
Yeah. Surely it was symbolic, and the issue of Eve taking a fruit from a tree from which God had been explicit is obviously the sin that is being referred to. Was it an apple? No. The only mention of apple directly we find in the Song of Solomon. Some have said it was an apricot, not an apple, but actually apple pips have been found in the Negev, in archaeological excavations. So I don't know, was it Michelangelo? What one of the pictures showing an apple being offered to Eve? One of the paintings from that time, from 15th, 16th century. So I mean, it's rather like the tree we meet at the end of Revelation, a magnificent tree, symbolic, representative. Yeah, so I'm going to skirt that question, if I may, and say, you know, well, one can't say a huge amount other than there was clearly an explicit breaking of an instruction. And of course, as we know, the tempter was tempting Eve and Adam to do that, you know, but not an apple. We don't know what it was. It was just a desirable fruit. And I don't know whether you're a fan of C.S. Lewis and the Narnia stories, but there's a fabulous picture in the Magician's Nephew of that account being described in that story. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carol.
Sorry, Carol, I've not answered that very well.
Oh no, that's I just wanted comments, really.
So thank you, Carol. Yeah, Julian, I've got another question about the properties of wood and how that's described. And you mentioned, I think, in your book about the Ark of the Covenant, and it's probably constructed out of acacia wood because it's less likely to warp. Did it surprise you that there's a level of detail that's clear in the Bible in terms of how different woods were used?
Oh yes, I mean, when I was answering the question much earlier on about what did surprise me, exactly that point, because the Ark of the that you're referring to and the tabernacle were constructed when the children of Israel were wandering in the wilderness. They were in the desert. And what were the trees they would have come across? Well, they wouldn't find oak, they wouldn't find cedar. Well, in fact, cedar is not native to Israel, not even on Mount Hermon. But what they would have would be acacias. And we know for certain that the word for acacia, shittim, S-H-I-T-T-I-M, was used frequently to describe. Moses was said it must be built from shittim, from acacia wood. And of course, we know that acacia is relatively stable timber, quite a heavy timber as well. But I'm just impressed that, as it were, God is a good silviculturist. He knew the trees, where the people were, for the ones so that they were able to use it right. And we have an example just before in Joshua, just before the people of Israel crossed the Jordan to begin their conquering of the promised land, and that remarkable account of Jericho falling. They're actually assembled in the place of acacias in Shittim, in woodland that's acacia dominated. So yeah, no, Chris, that's a really good point. I have been impressed that we're not told, oh, to make it out of a wood that's simply A, inappropriate, and B, they wouldn't find where they were.
Yeah, thank you.
I have something that slightly follows on from that, Julian, and it's about the carob tree or carob tree.
Carob, yeah, Serotonia.
That's it. It's mentioned as nourishing John the Baptist, and its ability to provide fodder. I think today we largely think of it as providing a sort of chocolate substitute. But are we missing a trick with this tree? Should we be using it more?
Well, anything that's like chocolate sounds good to me. But let me go back to the idea of carob. It is because it was known as the locust tree, and of course we are told that John the Baptist ate locusts. It is thought that it may not refer to the insect or the insect caterpillars, I suppose, but actually refer to Serotonia because it has these long curved pods. It is only speculative that that may be the case, though there was, I think, a Pharisee who hid for 12 years in a cave to escape the Roman occupiers, and he lived largely on carob seed. So yeah, and of course, the main thing that everybody knows about carob is that the seeds are so uniform that they would be used for weighing out gold and silver, hence the word karat for 24 karat gold and so on.
You've just told me something I didn't know.
Oh, that's where
Everybody else may have known that, Julian, but not me. That was fantastic.
Even better than chocolate.
Okay. I think now might be a good time to probably the single most famous sort of silviculturist or forester is John Evelyn, the sort of father of forestry, really. And I know, Julian, you've got there's a quote in your book. I just wondered if you could just hand over to your thoughts on that, and perhaps to finish with that quote that I know you like.
Yeah, this is what I want to share. There's another lovely illustration that Veronica has done. That's actually of myrtle. And this is just after in my talks, I'm talking about the wood of the cross. And in a way, what for me brings together my journey in writing this book, my Christian faith and my forest science and being a forestry, is what John Evelyn, who is surely the grandfather or father of modern forestry in our own country, with his wonderful silver, he wrote these words, and they so resonate for me, and I hope for you as I read them to you or you read them from the screen. In a word, and to speak a bold and noble truth, trees and woods have twice saved the whole world, first by the ark, then by the cross, making full amends for the evil fruit of the tree in paradise, by that which was born on the tree in Golgotha. The reference, of course, to the crucifixion of the Lord Jesus Christ. So, such a great man in the history of British forestry, and he brings together his own faith in that way, and certainly that resonates for me. And if I may, Chris, can I just share one more slide?
Yeah.
I've told you that C.S. Lewis is sort of my hero, as it were, and he said famously of his faith, I believe in Christianity as I believe the sun has risen, not only because I see it, because by it I see everything else. And I'm often asked, rather as you are, how writing this book has affected me, and I simply say that I kind of parody what he says. As a forest scientist, appreciating better the trees we find in the Bible's narrative has helped me appreciate better its far greater story. So yeah, I mean, that, as it were, sums up for me my own journey in this, as well as the great John Evelyn. Also, that's an advertorial. Am I allowed to have that?
You certainly are, Julian.
If anybody wants to buy a copy, just email me using that email address, or I'm sure either Wendy or someone in RFS can forward your email to me. And the book's normally £25. You can have it for 20, and that includes postage and packaging too. But yeah, but no, it's really good. And if there are still any other questions, do do please.
So I think,
There you
okay.
go.
Well, it just remains for me to say on behalf of everyone, so thank you, Julian, for a lovely evening talking us through your remarkable book. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. I hope you've enjoyed the session as much as I know Wendy and I have. So I mentioned earlier about that Julian runs courses sometimes, and he's actually got one coming up in April. So if you want to see Julian in person, you could look at our website and you might be able to join him in his woods and learn more about silviculture with Julian. So book club will return in the autumn. We don't have a date yet, but watch this space. I'll watch our website for news on that. And just finally, so Julian, thank you again for taking us through fascinating book, God's Trees, and good night, everyone.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.